I am Cassandra and welcome back to the Oxford Weaving Studio YouTube channel. Today we're talking about Rya Knots and Rya Loops. Now this is a new weaving techniques video in our series of weaving techniques, and you're going to learn how to put your Rya Knots or Rya Loops in different ways on different shapes and forms. And the reason I'm showing them together is because they are very similar techniques and you can kind of interchange them. So let's get started. Hi, so thank you for joining me. I've got the table set up here with two different projects. We're going to finish off some of the Rya Loops on this circular art piece so I can show you what it looks like to do a continuous piece of continuous series of Rya Loops. And I'm going to set up my little mini frame loom here and show you Rya Knots as well. And it will depend on how many Rya Knots you want to make or how many Rya Loops. So if you want a whole bunch or just a few, the technique will depend on that. So for Rya Knots, it's a little bit different. We're going to use a continuous piece, and I'll use maybe the dark blue to show this off. And again, this type of yarn, just so you can see the difference. And so I'm going to pull out a continuous piece. Now the thing with a Rya Loop is that a Rya Loop tends to work knotting it onto one individual warp thread. So the advantage of that is that it creates a much fuller fringe. In this way, because you're facing it to the front and it's wrapping over two, or actually you could wrap it over 3 or 4, as many as you want, and you could double or triple or quadruple the warp thread. So it's possible to wrap it over more ends, but essentially it's a flat sort of face forward version where you see this nice wrapping bit. But if you do the Rya Loops or the Fringe in a continuous motion, essentially what you're doing is you're knotting it onto the warp strings. Now you could warp it, you could attach it onto 2, but it pulls and draws them together. So if your continuation of your pattern later on means that you need these open, you will get this effect where they are gathered together when you've done your loops, and then later on you're going to have to use plain weave or other techniques, other patterns in order to open it up again. So again, it depends on your type of design. Okay, so now we're going to start with the Rya Loops. We're going to take the first bit and we're going to wrap it over on its own. Essentially, the first time you do it, you're going to have one long stringy end. That's not a loop, but I'll show you how that sort of carries on as we go. Grab the middle bit, put your fingers inside, wrap it under your first warp thread and pull both sides completely through. So the first side you're going to pull, you're going to be able to release that, the end. But can you see here, we've already created one little loop. So I want to make a fringe or loops that sit lower on this, but not covering it completely. So I'm going to pull until I think roughly I'm going to get the length I want. Once you've got the length you want, you pull down and you tighten. So I'm holding the other end because it's the first one, and that will eventually get tucked under. But because it's the first one, it kind of creates a little bit of a problem. So now that you've got the rest of your yarns behind you, I'm going to stick this through kind of the back, I guess you'd say, go to the back of the loom. And I'm going to pick up the next warp thread. I'm going to push through this one here, like this. So it's coming up through and under that second warp thread. Again, we have our fingers through the middle, and we're going to pull the single thread that's here. We're going to create our knot, and slowly, 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 oh, I'm pushing down too hard. Slowly, 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 pulling down so that we measure up the length of our second Rya loop. And it's a bit of practice to kind of negotiate how much you pull down on your loop versus how much you're knotting on your warp string. So let's have a look at that again. So now it's coming up through the front. There we go, that's fine. Now, again, I'm laying it across. I'm picking up warp thread number 3 with my 2 fingers. I'm pulling the long end through, and then I'm pulling down and tightening as I go, working out where that warp thread goes and where the loop goes. So that's roughly the same. Okay, again, number 4, picking it up with my fingers, pinching that long end, the working end that we've got, all the way till we think it's roughly the length that we want. then grabbing that one and pulling through and tightening, and again adjusting the length as we go. So it's a bit of a practice to see how accurate you can be. It takes a bit of practice like that, but as you can see here, I'll finish those off in a moment, it's still kind of sitting under the back of the frame. Yeah, so I'm pulling it up and across, and the way the knots sit, they are actually sitting right bunched up here on the front. So the way that they look is very different than if you do a single Rya knot. So if you like this flat kind of forward facing knot, then you want to do the classic where you cut each one first, then you wrap it around your warp threads, or the continuous one, which is the Rya Loops, is a continuous bit. So again, I'm pulling this across, I'm grabbing my next warp thread, pinching the long end, pulling and measuring how far down I want it, and going from there. So if you wanted now to trim your knots, you could then, this one is obviously a little bit longer than the others, you could then grab your scissors and just cut all of your loops, and you can have a fringe. Now the Rya loops you can do and keep them as loops. You can make them shorter, and I'll show you that in a moment. But I just wanted to show you how to make fringe when it's longer, and then you can later on go and trim that and see how it looks with your fringe that you have beneath it. Okay, so now I have my long end. So I'm going to keep this, what I call the working end, I'm going to keep it on top. Let's start again. You've got your two ends. We're making this extra long because it's the starting point. You want to put your fingers inside. Let's actually lay it across the first warp end. We're then going to put our fingers inside and pick up both sides of the yarn, and we're going to pull down on one side, and we have our first Rya loop, and we're going to tuck that one behind. So now, if you can see here, we're going to lay it across, we're going to pick up our second warp thread, we're going to pull this singular one from the long working end, and we're going to pull that down using the front here to decide, pulling the other end to decide how short or how long we want fringe. So I'm going to make a shorter fringe this time. I'm going to do a second row just to show you how you can make a really thick fringe. Just be mindful you can pull out your knots. So what I'm going to do here is you can create, if you've seen any of those lovely textures where people have really compacted, very tight, fine yarns where they're all, I'm trying to think of people who do this. Juju Just on Instagram, she does some beautiful pieces, but they create these lovely, really densely packed pieces where you do lots and lots of Rya loops or knots in a very confined area, and then you trim them so you get this lovely chunky feel. So that is a possibility. The one thing I will recommend, again, plain weave. These knots, if you watch this, if I just pull this, they all come undone. So the problem that you have is if you don't secure them in between, the chances are if you're not careful, they will undo. And again, this is more for a practical piece, rather like a scarf or a cushion. So what I would recommend, and actually if you are, if you don't want to see your plain weave in behind your Rya knots, I would suggest you use your continuous piece that you've got here and just use your fingers. Oh, it's come undone from its bundle. And just weave your row or two of plain weave in between so that you don't actually see the yarn, the difference in the yarn, so that you have a nice stable cloth and it doesn't fall apart and you don't see it. So I hope this helps you. There are different ways of doing it. So you start off with your cutting your Rya knots and measuring them out. If you're just doing a small amount, or you want a flat facing Rya knot, you can create Rya knots by creating first the Rya loops. And again, the Rya loops, it's different ways to do it so that it uses one individual warp thread. You could actually use two if you wanted, but I've just done one so that the spacing remains consistent, and it gives you a much fuller fuller fringe or fuller loops. And then to create the actual Rya knots, if you've created loops first, is simply just to go and cut them and trim them later on. So that's the way to weave lots of them on a continuous thread, and if you're wanting to weave them quicker. So thanks very much for joining me for this tutorial. I hope it's been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please pop those in the box down below. And if you'd like to follow me on Instagram, you can, and follow me at Oxford Weaving Studio. Same on Facebook. And of course, I'd love for you to subscribe to my channel as I get more videos uploaded and keep going. Now that we're out of lockdown, I'm hoping I can be in the studio more regularly and keep filming videos. So if you like the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Thanks again. See you next time.